All right, welcome to episode 2 of the A-Push writing series, our year-long series on how to write for A-Push. And today we're going to look at thesis crafting. Your goal here is to find the center of gravity. When you're writing a thesis, the thesis, of course, is like the whole point of your essay. And your goal is to try to figure out what's going on here with this topic. Where's the center of gravity? So we'll talk about that. But first, this is Herodotus, and he was alive over 2,000 years ago, and he is the first to write history the way we write it today, hence the title, the father of history. That's what he's called. So what does that mean, to write history the way we write it today? It means that before Herodotus, at its best, history was like a summary of things. What he does is he turns it into an analytical process. He wanted to find out why the Greeks and Persians fought these wars, a series of wars. And so he set out to try to answer that question. So he had a question in his head, sort of like this intellectual itch that needed scratching. And he just was trying to figure out, like, how did we get here? And so he goes around the ancient world, he interviews people, he looks at all kinds of evidence, and then he writes a book. And so his book is called The Histories, and here's his famous introduction. He says, "This is the showing forth of the inquiry of Herodotus." So what he's saying here is, he's saying, I'm showing forth like the product of my inquiry. So if I paraphrase him, he's saying, here is the product of my inquiry. And so inquiry, incidentally, is the Greek word for history. And so I love that because it reminds us that from the very beginning, history is an inquiry process. It's a way of trying to reach an understanding of things. It's not about long lists of things and memorizing mountains of information. It's a process where we build meaning. And so he goes on to say that what I try to do is explain the causes for which these waged war with one another. These people waged war with one another. And so again, that's what you're going to be doing here. It's like when you write an essay, this is the showing forth of your inquiry. This is the product of your inquiry. Here, I've studied this, and here's how I'm making sense of it. So in our A-Push writing series, we're going to have different lessons in the first semester to get us to the point where we can write full essays. So we've already have the essay cues are done under our belt. We'll write other essay cues, but that's where the instruction is, and of course we'll have follow-up instruction. But all these parts, all these segments, will be online for you to access at any time, so you can always review them. And all of it is based on what the College Board puts out there as far as like what students need to do for writing essays. So they give teachers rubrics, samples, everything, webinars, everything. So I've tried to study this as best I can to make sense of this, for you and guide you through to write the best essays that you can. And so my belief is that if you're invested in this program, that not only will you be able to write well on the exam, but also beyond the exam. So this isn't just like a test prep course. It's really trying to help you write well for your purposes beyond that exam. So anyway, here's this is episode 2, which is thesis, obviously, and then we're going to talk about introductions and then the art of support, and then we're going to finish up that part of the year with something called close and the conclusion, and then we're going to be ready to write a full long answer question essay, which is called an LEQ. And you're also going to then move on from there, and we're going to write a full document-based question essay, which is a DBQ. So the only difference between those is the document-based essay has primary sources that you have to weave in to your argument. Writing is a big deal in this course because writing is a big deal on the exam. As you might remember, 60% of your score is based on writing. And so we really study this in parts in the first semester, and we build up to the point of writing a full essay. All right. Here's somebody else. This is Bob Woodward. and he is the investigative reporter. He and his partner, um, they, they broke the Watergate story for the Washington Post back in the early 70s. And that's what he looked like in the early 70s. And so he is called the father of investigative journalism. So that, when you talk to current investigative journalists, they basically are, the way they explain their work is they're doing what Woodward and his partner Bernstein did with the Watergate scandal, is that they went around to try to figure out what's going on. They went around and they, gathered all this information, interviews, etc., and tried to make sense of it. So that, very much this is an inquiry process. So like, a historian is like a detective or like an investigative journalist trying to get to some sort of meaningful truth of what has happened in the past. And so here's what he looks like today. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because when asked about how he writes books, and he's written 19 of them, he just released his 19th book this fall. So he was asked, how do you come up with the topics for your book? And he explained, well, I take a presidency, usually he writes about presidents, and he said he starts to study it and he tries to find the center of gravity. So according to one of his friends, what Woodward does is basically like turn on a vacuum cleaner. Before, he doesn't know what he's going to write about. He just starts talking to people and reading and interviewing people. And then once he does that, he then sort of zeroes in, aha, this is what this presidency is about. Whether it's, about starting a war, or whether it's about, trying to get credibility with the American people, or the political fights. He tries to find where the center of gravity is for that presidency. And so he's done that with President Trump. He's been working on a book for a little while. And like I said, he just released it, his 19th book. And so what was the center of gravity as he started to interview people? Well, he gives us some indication of what that is with the book's title. And then also, as you know, some authors oftentimes will have a quote to start the book, and that's there for a reason. That's prime real estate, and the author's trying to tell us something, that the book is, somewhat about this. And so here was the center of gravity for Woodward after he studied the Trump presidency. Fear. So that's a kind of a controversial title, but he's making a claim. He's saying that to understand this presidency, it's helpful to understand how President Trump sees power. And this comes from an interview that when President Trump was a candidate, Bob Woodward asked him, what is power? How would you define power? And so at the time, candidate Trump said, real power is, I don't even want to use the word fear. So Trump realizes that this is, kind of not politically correct, but he feels that real power is about fear. So Woodward writes this book, and along the way, he basically explains like this leadership style, or this belief that power is about fear, leads to problems and chaos in his presidency and in the administration. And so anyway, that's what the book's about. That was his center of gravity that he found. All right. So how do you come up with a thesis? I got a couple slides to help here. So here's this slide is about like the process. It starts with deep content knowledge. So I've tried to stress that in this class, that there's really no substitute for understanding, the basics and how everything connects together. So that's why we have our ERIC quizzes to get like a good baseline, then we build on that in class. But it's hard to fool your way through an essay. And again, 60% of your A-Push exam is writing, and so we want you to have a good deep content knowledge. And why is that? Because sometimes people think like, oh, I know a lot of stuff, and that's going to help me on the multiple choice. But being a writer is something different. Like, it's like a different set of skills that you need for writing. And it's not so much about knowing stuff. It's just being able to be a good writer. Well, it's not really true. In order to have something to say, you need to base it on something, on some sort of knowledge. So think about maybe like a big project that you've worked on, for at some point in your academic career, and when you really understand something, you spend time with it, really understand it, something magical happens. You have more to say about it. You have something interesting to say about it. And conversely, if you don't know much about something, your thesis statements and your essays are really superficial. They really fall flat. So we want you to have, that good content knowledge. Anyway, once you do that, then you can find the center of gravity and find where's the action for this topic. From there, you can craft a rough thesis in your pre-writing stage. We'll talk about that. Everybody should do pre-writing before they start writing the essay. And then something interesting about this fourth point here, you're going to work your thesis into the essay, but you have one of two choices where to put it. You can put it, the College Board says you can put it in the conclusion, or you can put it in the introduction. So we'll talk more about this, but I think there are some real advantages of putting your thesis in the conclusion. And so at least for a while, that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna teach you, how to do that and why it's a good idea. And then after a while, I will leave it up to you. So then it'll be your choice where you put it. But first, I want you to learn how to place it in the conclusion. But that's something for another day. You don't have to worry about that today. Okay, now let's talk about the criteria of a strong thesis. And again, this is based on, my studies of the APUSH exam. They release rubrics, essays for us to study. They wrote webinars, everything for us to learn about, how to do this so we can teach it to you. So here it is. First of all, your thesis should answer the question. A strong thesis answers the question. So a lot of times students, if there's a prompt on the causes of the Civil War, a student might write on the Civil War. And so this is the number one mistake that kids make on the APUSH exam, is that they're in the ballpark, but they're not quite answering the question. There's something that they're missing. That's why we spent some time, breaking down one prompt. And you don't have that much time is that we took that first time, but mentally you should break it down so you understand what your mission is. Also, you'll notice that every prompt has one of the featured reasoning skills. So comparison, causation, or continuity. And so your thesis should show that. It should show. We should be able to. We don't even look at a prompt. If we look at your thesis, we should be able to tell, what skill you're answering to. All right. Next, the College Board says that your thesis should have a defensible claim. What that means is it should be grounded in content knowledge. It should be grounded in facts, in evidence. At the same time, it should not be a dump of knowledge. The thesis is not the place to pack in all kinds of packet terms. You can use those later in the essay, but here you're just writing here's my brief answer to this question, and it kind of sets up your argument. Next, your thesis should be thoughtful. You should have something to say about it. It's not a yes/no answer. So if you're answering a thesis or a question in a yes/no format, you're really just restating the thesis, and we don't want to do that. So one thing that's helpful is, as you're crafting your thesis, try asking yourself why or how so. I think that helps. Why did this happen? Why is this changing over time? Or why did this lead to this? Or how so? It depends on the question, the type of prompt, but why or how so can really help, I think. Then finally, we should be able to understand it. It's got to be 1 to 2 clear, focused sentences. And again, I'm quoting the College Board. A strong thesis establishes a line of reasoning, meaning we should be able to look at it and kind of tell where you're going or where you've been with your essay. What are the different things you're going to write about? And so that's what that means when it says establish a line of reasoning. It's about, we should be able to tell what the structure of your essay is, basically. Okay, let's take a look. This is a released set of thesis statements. Here's a question. The question is, evaluate the extent to which the Civil War fostered change in the United States economy in the period from 1861 to 1900. That word British shouldn't be there. We can have to cross that out. But basically, we want to see to what extent did the Civil War change the U.S. economy from the period 1861 to 1900. And so here are some examples of what the College Board thinks are pretty good thesis statements, and here are ones that are not so good. So what I want you to do now is I want you to turn and talk. I want you to look at your notes, the 4 criteria of a strong thesis, and then use that to evaluate these examples. So, why are some good and not so good if we match them up to the 4 criteria? So, turn to a partner or little groups of 2 or 3 and talk about this. So again, here is the prompt, and here are the thesis statements. So go ahead and pause this for 2 minutes, and then come back together. Okay, you're back, and maybe go around and find some answers that people had for just a brief time, maybe like 30 seconds or so. Just get some responses out there so the whole class can hear. And then we're going to move on. Now I'm going to try it. So I'm going to write a thesis statement. So here's a different prompt. Evaluate the extent of similarity between the economies of the Chesapeake and New England in the period from 1607 to 1754. And so right here we see this is a comparison question, similarity, and it's about economies. So okay, and I got to see the time period, so I think I know how to do this. So here I go. I'm going to craft, and I'm going to remember. I got to do this. I've got to answer the question. It's got to be defensible claim. Something thoughtful. Here's the product of my inquiry, and it should be clear. So here's what I came up with. While both economies feature economic liberty and some economic opportunity, so there's the similarity part, each has a very different focus. Meanwhile, the central role of unskilled labor in the Chesapeake defines not just the economy, but its social structure. So I know there's a lot going on there. You can always pause, go back and pick this apart more. But it might help to look. Here's like a rough outline. So if I'm in my pre-writing, I'm going to jot down like an outline. So you should be able to see that my line of reasoning is right in the outline here. So here we go. Here's how they're similar. Both regions, their economies are similar. There's a great degree of economic liberty, and there's some economic opportunity. There's a little more in New England than there is in the Chesapeake, but there's lots of things to point to, like the headright system, as evidence of economic opportunity for that time. Now we get on to the differences. So to me, the center of gravity is about differences, and it has something to do with unskilled labor. So when I thought about the center of gravity of this, I thought about the fact that there's something about the unskilled labor that's in both regions and how it leads to such different societies. So I'm going to have a section of here about, this is just very basic, like, hey, one's tobacco and one is more diverse based on farming, fishing, trade. And so that would be my shortest paragraph would be this one. My longest is going to be this. So here's another thing that you should understand in APUSH. I know that like when you're taught to do some current event writing along the way, you're usually told to put your strongest argument first in the body. But in APUSH, you want to put things in chronological order. That dictates everything. And then for a question like this, I think that it helps to kind of build up to actually your biggest point being the final point here. So that's a little bit different than maybe how you've been writing in the past. All right, so here's where the real action is, I think, is that unskilled labor leads to a top-heavy economy in the Chesapeake, meaning like very few haves and a lot of have-nots. It's a little bit of that going on in New England, but way more in the Chesapeake. And then it even spills over into the social structure and helps explain the differences in social structure between the two regions. And so for me, that's where the money is for this question. And that's my center of gravity, and I'm going to base my essay on that. So now you try it. So we've been studying this topic of slavery last couple days. And here are the reasoning skills. We're going to ignore skill 1 for now. And our questions are really going to come from either this one, comparison, causation, or continuity. And so your question is obviously one about change, continuity and change. And so also, but know that, in your thesis, And throughout the essay, you're probably going to use some of these other ones, especially causation. So when I think about writing this essay, I think that I would, it's about how things change over time, but I'm going to be talking about like the little things that are causing the changes, like why is it changing over time? So there you go. There's that why question. When you think about this and all the notes you've taken on your big arrow, think about why things are changing. And again, here are your criteria. And let's go ahead and finish this up for tomorrow. And it's just got to be rough. So you're going to complete the historian's notebook for today. It's homework tonight. And let's see what you come up with. What's the product of your inquiry? Where's the center of gravity for this topic of slavery? So thanks, and we'll talk about this first thing tomorrow.